But citizens of the world's oldest democracy, the United States, can't be that easily manipulated by cues that trigger their biases in favor of us and against them, can they?
The Census Bureau estimates that at least by the year 2043, and possibly sooner, the U.S. will be a majority non-white nation.
That's the question that the widespread media coverage of the 2010 census projection that white Americans would soon be a minority triggered for Yale psychologist Jennifer Richeson.
I was listening to the radio, noticed these reports about the changing demographics of the United States getting repeated.
People of color accounted for 91.7% of growth. It's like the future of our country on steroids, and it's happening now.
And I would see it on my Twitter feed or, in social media outlets, these articles about this happening. And I'm thinking, wow, social psychology suggests that this type of communication and how it's constructed as majority minority, right, or this coming white minority is probably going to be threatening to lots of white people, right? Lots of, people who maybe don't think of themselves in terms of their racial group membership, but this type of communication will suddenly make them think of themselves in terms of their racial group membership, and in a very defensive way that's likely to lead to the expression of racial bias. And that's just where we started.
Richeson and colleagues at Northwestern conducted a study that was released before the 2016 presidential election that was later nicknamed the Rise of Trump Study. First, the researchers asked nearly 1,000 white participants what kind of government they favored. Very conservative, very liberal, or somewhere in between. Then they exposed half the participants to media coverage of the census forecast. The news that white Americans would soon make up less than half the population had been covered by every network.
For the first time, minority groups now account for about half of American children under the age of 5.
Census Bureau figures show more minority babies now being born than non-Hispanic whites.
The researchers exposed the other half of the participants to entirely different, neutral information. Then they asked both groups what kind of government they now favored, given the information they'd just been exposed to. The political views of the group that watched the neutral information didn't change, but the views of the group that watched the news clip about white people becoming a minority changed dramatically.
It led to greater endorsement of politically conservative positions on a broad range of policies, from drilling in the Arctic to tax policy to healthcare policies, and of course, what you'd expect, policies that are most relevant to racial attitudes and policies. So, immigration policy, affirmative action, those types of things.
To confirm that the shift toward conservative politics was caused by fear of the consequences of being a minority, Richeson then conducted another version of the study, in which participants who watched news coverage of the census were afterwards reassured about white people's future status in society.
We say, you know what? Even in a future where whites are less than 50% of the population, because of, any number of factors, including different access to education, to jobs, to training, whites on average will still maintain a dominant status, meaning access to resources, jobs, political influence. And so, not that much is going to change actually in terms of how society operates despite the fact that the numbers are changing.
When they were reassured that white people would remain dominant, the people who saw the census information no longer supported a more conservative government. It was confirmation that it was simply being made to feel that white dominance was threatened, which had caused them to change their politics. So it turns out that even in the world's oldest democracy, you can get people to change their politics simply by giving them cues that almost automatically trigger us versus them thinking. And there is nothing unique about that. Groups of humans throughout history have been vulnerable to having their decisions hacked by cues that trigger their biases in favor of us and against them. But what's different today is that the hackers now have a tool that would make a 20th century dictator drool: social media. So maybe it's not surprising that the old certainty that democracy would eventually spread around the world is suddenly fading.
Turns out that's looking like it was wrong. We're seeing far-right parties in Europe laughing at a democracy and the liberal order the way Mussolini did, and subverting the mechanisms of control on their power, like the judiciary and the press. Of course, the United States, there are also threats from the left. There are threats of political correctness that are trying to restrict freedom of speech. So we are entering a period in which our certainties about democracy and freedom from the 20th century are being questioned from both the right and the left.
And in the United States, the retreat by each side into its own social media echo chamber, where they only hear from people who think just like them, has become one of the greatest threats our democracy has ever faced.
Now, because of social media, anytime a swastika is drawn anywhere in America, or anytime someone says something rude or aggressive to a Muslim or an African American, that can get picked up and made national. And since we'll never get to zero, these things are always going to happen somewhere in our country of 330 million, so there will always be a supply between 10 and 1,000 incidents every day to keep the left in a permanent state of outrage. And same for the right. It's very hard to have democracy under those circumstances because democracy requires us to compromise. But how can you compromise with them when they are so evil?
One result is that amid the most avid consumers of social media, young people, fewer than 1/3 think it's very important to live in a democracy. And 1 in 6 think that, given what they've been told on social media about what a mess the United States is, it would be better if the military took over.
Maybe it's time we face the fact that it is very, very hard to run a country in which everybody has freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to vote, especially when that country is filled with people of different ethnic backgrounds and religions and political points of view. Considering everything that we know about how vulnerable we are to our own biases and to manipulation, maybe the challenge here isn't, spreading democracy around the world. Maybe it's just keeping it alive.